How Rome Fell, The Long Road to 476 CE. There's a date most of us know, 476 CE, the year the Western Roman Empire fell. But here's the thing about that date. It's more like a milestone marker on a very long road than the edge of a cliff. Because Rome didn't fall in a day, or even in a decade. It took centuries of pressure, compromise, crisis, and transformation to bring down the largest empire the Mediterranean world had ever known. So if you have ever wondered what actually happened, not the simple version, but the real, complicated, human story, then let's walk that road together, from Rome's height all the way down to its last emperor in the West, and see what survived beyond. When we say fall, what do we mean? Before we go any further, we need to be clear about what we're talking about, because Rome could mean a lot of things: the city itself, the empire as a whole, the western half that eventually collapsed, or the broader Roman world, its laws, its culture, the way it shaped how people lived and fall. That's just as slippery. Do we mean military defeat? Economic breakdown? The moment central authority dissolved? Or something slower, a transformation into something we no longer recognize as Roman? 476 is convenient. It's the year a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a teenager with the rather unfortunate name of Romulus Augustulus. But Romans had been struggling with fragmentation and crisis for centuries before that moment, and much of what made Rome Roman lived on long after. So our real question isn't what happened in 476, it's more demanding than that. What we're really asking is, what long chain of changes made an empire like Rome unable to continue as it had before? Rome at its peak and the cracks underneath, let's start near the top. By the 2nd century CE, under emperors like Trajan and Hadrian, Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean coastline, most of Western Europe, the Balkans, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. It looked unshakable. Marble cities, busy trade routes, legions stationed along thousands of miles of frontier, from the Rhine and Danube in the north to the deserts of North Africa and the Euphrates in the east. But beneath all that marble, there were problems. Built-in vulnerabilities that would become catastrophic under stress. First, overextension. Moving troops from one frontier crisis to another took months. Communication from the center to the edges was agonizingly slow. One emperor, even with governors and generals helping, couldn't react quickly to multiple threats at once. Second, succession. There was no clear, peaceful way to choose the next emperor. In theory, the Senate and the army both mattered. In practice, the army's loyalty decided who ruled, and that meant every imperial death risked civil war. Third, economics. Early on, Rome expanded constantly, and conquest brought plunder and new taxpayers. But as expansion slowed and stopped, Rome kept all the costs of empire, armies, bureaucracy, infrastructure, without the regular windfalls of new territory. The system was designed to grow. When it stopped growing, it began to strain. For a while, good administration held it together, but the machinery was fragile. When serious stress came, it cracked. The 3rd century crisis, Rome in freefall. That stress arrived in full force during what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Roughly 235 to 284 CE. This is the first great shudder in Rome's long fall. Over those 50 years, the empire suffered nearly constant civil war. Dozens of emperors and would-be emperors rose and fell, many assassinated, some killed in battle, others overthrown by their own troops. Rival claimants fought each other across provinces, pulling legions away from the frontiers just when they were needed most. While the empire tore itself apart internally, external threats multiplied. Germanic groups crossed the Rhine and Danube with increasing frequency. In the east, the Sasanian Persian Empire captured Roman territory and even in one humiliating episode captured a Roman emperor himself, Valerian, taken prisoner in battle. Parts of the empire broke away entirely. The Gallic Empire in the northwest and Palmyra's desert kingdom in the east functioned as separate states for years, their rulers claiming Roman legitimacy but acting independently. Economically, it was chaos. The currency was debased, less silver, more cheap metal, and inflation soared. Trade routes became unsafe. Agricultural production was disrupted by war and raids. For ordinary people, this wasn't an abstract crisis. It was tax collectors demanding more to fund endless wars. markets disrupted, city walls hastily strengthened as fear became a way of life. Yet Rome survived. That's the remarkable thing. It shouldn't have by all logic, but it did. Diocletian, rebuilding an empire on the edge. The emperor who pulled Rome back from the brink was Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305. He didn't patch holes. He renovated the entire building. Diocletian's conclusion was stark. One man could not effectively govern this sprawling empire anymore. His solution was radical. He created the Tetrarchy, rule by 4, to senior emperors called Augusti and to junior emperors called Caesos. Each ruled different regions but were supposed to act in harmony. In theory, this meant faster responses to threats and less temptation for border generals to declare themselves emperor. In reality, it set a precedent for divided imperial authority. It made the idea of a permanently split empire thinkable. And when cooperation failed, which it eventually did, it opened new routes to conflict. Diocletian also reorganized the provinces, subdividing them into smaller units to prevent any single governor from becoming too powerful. He reformed taxation, introducing more systematic censuses and increasing reliance on taxes paid in grain and supplies rather than coins. For peasants and landowners, this meant heavier, more regular obligations. It also meant less mobility, people increasingly tied to their land or occupation. A step toward the bound agricultural labor that would characterize much of the medieval world. The empire that emerged from his reign was more managed, more bureaucratic, more rigid, stronger in some ways, more brittle in others. Constantine, a Christian empire, and a new capital after Diocletian, the tetrarchic system collapsed into yet another series of civil wars. Out of that chaos emerged Constantine. Constantine's reign changed Rome in two fundamental ways. First, Christianity. Constantine issued the Edict of Milan in 313, granting toleration to Christians after brutal persecutions under earlier emperors. He favored the church with patronage and privileges. Over the following decades, Christianity moved from persecuted minority to dominant religion. Did Christianity cause Rome's fall? Some older writers thought so, that it weakened the martial spirit, diverted resources to churches instead of armies. Most modern historians see this as oversimplified. Christianity also provided new forms of cohesion. Christian bishops sometimes organized defense, welfare, and negotiation with invaders. And many of the so-called barbarian groups entering the empire converted to Christianity themselves. Religion profoundly changed the Roman world, but it's one factor among many, not a single trigger. Constantine's second major decision was perhaps even more consequential. He founded a new capital on the site of the old Greek city Byzantium. He built Constantinople, strategically positioned to control the straits between the Mediterranean and Black Sea, close to the wealthy eastern provinces and key frontiers. This shifted the empire's center of gravity eastward. The city of Rome remained symbolically important, but was no longer the true center of power. The eastern provinces, richer, more urbanized, more commercially active, gained even more prominence. This matters because centuries later, when the Western Empire fragmented, the East, based in Constantinople, would continue calling itself the Roman Empire for nearly 1,000 years more. The 4th century, uneasy balance, the 4th century is a kind of plateau. Crises eased, but the underlying problems remained. It became common to have separate emperors for East and West. Brothers Valentinian, the first and Valens, for instance, divided the empire between them. This division allowed focus on region-specific problems, but also encouraged divergence. The East had wealthier cities, denser populations, stronger tax revenues. It could maintain larger, better-funded armies and bureaucracies. The West included many frontier regions and less urbanized areas. It was more vulnerable, and when territories were lost, the West lost more heavily. Along the northern frontiers, the Rhine and Danube, the empire's strategy increasingly relied on what were called foederati agreements. These were deals with non-Roman groups, often Germanic peoples like Franks, Goths, and Alemanni. Rome would settle them on imperial territory in exchange for military service. They kept their own leaders, but agreed to fight for Rome. This filled gaps in manpower as recruiting Roman citizens grew harder. But it also created pockets of armed, semi-autonomous groups inside the empire. The system could work, but it required good faith, fair treatment, and competent management. Those conditions were often not met. and the consequences of mismanagement were about to become catastrophic. The Huns, the Goths, and Adrianople in the later 4th century. A new force appeared on Rome's horizons. The Huns, the steppe peoples, moving westward, put enormous pressure on the Germanic groups living near Rome's borders. Some fought the Huns and lost. Others fled westward, seeking refuge inside the empire. In 376, a large group of Goths asked permission to cross the Danube into Roman territory. The Eastern Emperor Valens agreed on conditions. They would surrender weapons, be settled as foederati, and provide soldiers for Rome. In principle, this could have worked. Instead, it became a disaster. Local Roman officials exploited the desperate Goths, charging extortionate prices for food. Promised supplies were delayed or never came. Resentment and hunger grew. The situation spiraled into open revolt. In 378, Valens decided to confront the Goths near Adrianople. Eager for glory, perhaps underestimating the enemy, he engaged without waiting for reinforcements. The Gothic forces, including a strong cavalry component, shattered the Roman army. Valens himself was killed, one of the rare occasions a Roman emperor died in a major defeat against foreign enemies. Adrianople exposed serious weaknesses. It showed Rome could no longer guarantee victory even in the heart of its territory. It demonstrated the consequences of overconfidence and poor coordination between East and West, but it wasn't the end. The new emperor Theodosius made peace. The Goths were settled again as foederati, retaining considerable autonomy. Stability was restored for a time, but once again, the empire's survival depended on incorporating large, armed, culturally distinct groups within its borders under politically fragile arrangements. The crumbling West by the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the Western Empire was structurally fragile in ways the East was not. Economically, the East was simply wealthier. Major cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople as long-distance trade networks. Rich agricultural regions in Egypt and Syria. When pressure mounted, the East had more taxable wealth to fund armies and bureaucracy. The West had important cities, Rome, Milan, Carthage, but many regions were less urbanized, less commercially vibrant. Its economic networks were more vulnerable to disruption. Politically, Western emperors increasingly struggled to maintain authority over powerful generals. Figures like Stilicho, Idius, and later Ricimer wielded enormous military power. Emperors were sometimes little more than ceremonial figures, manipulated or replaced at will. Long-term planning became nearly impossible. Militarily, the Western army relied more and more on foederati units and officers of non-Roman origin. This wasn't simply barbarization. Many of these men were deeply integrated into Roman structures. But loyalty networks became more complex. Leaders might prioritize their own people or followers over the imperial state. The line between Roman officer and foreign warlord blurred, and fiscally, as territories were lost, so were tax revenues, losing Gaul, Spain, and most critically, North Africa. With its rich grain supplies, meant the Western government could not reliably pay troops and officials. Unpaid armies became prone to mutiny, desertion, or switching loyalty to whoever could feed them. A government that cannot fund its army is always in danger. The West was moving steadily toward that danger. The early 5th century, everything breaks. The early 400s are where centuries of slow strain begin to show as visible fractures. Around 406, several groups, Vandals, Suabi, Alans, crossed the frozen Rhine into Roman Gaul. Why, then? Pressure from other peoples, Roman weakness, opportunity. Once inside, they moved through Gaul into Spain and eventually North Africa. Imperial forces struggled to contain them, often too distracted by civil conflicts. Roman Britain saw its legions withdrawn. Troops were needed closer to the imperial core. By around 410, imperial support had faded completely. Britain slipped out of Roman control. For the empire, it was a sign that peripheral territories were now expendable in the desperate attempt to hold the center. Then came one of the most symbolic events of the era. In 410, the Visigothic leader, Alaric, once a Roman ally, became disillusioned by broken promises and unpaid troops. He led his forces into Italy and sacked the city of Rome. This wasn't total destruction, but it was the first time in roughly 800 years that Rome had been taken by a foreign army. The psychological impact was enormous. Rome was supposed to be eternal, the symbolic heart of civilization. That it could be stormed shook fundamental assumptions about divine favor, imperial strength, and the order of the world. Yet even this was not the end. The machinery of state persisted. Emperors still ruled from Ravenna, a more defensible capital in northern Italy. The Western Empire staggered on the Vandals and the loss of Africa after moving through Gaul and Spain. The Vandals crossed into North Africa around 429. By 439, they had captured Carthage, one of the most important cities in the Western Empire. This was a catastrophic blow. North Africa was a major grain producer. Losing it meant losing food shipments, a severe blow to imperial provisioning. It also meant losing significant tax revenue at a time when the Western government desperately needed funds. And the Vandals built a navy, raiding coastal cities throughout the Mediterranean, including Rome itself in 455. Without Africa, the Western Empire's financial system never recovered. This loss is one of the critical structural blows from which the West could not realistically bounce back. Attila, Idias, and the last defense in the mid-5th century. The Huns, now under Attila, became a dominating presence in European politics. They extracted tribute from Roman territories, forced Germanic groups into alliances or submission, and built a fearsome reputation. For the West, much of the response depended on one man, Flavius Idias, often called the last of the Romans. He served as the Western Empire's leading general, balancing alliances with various Germanic groups, using diplomacy and force to keep the West from disintegrating faster than it already was. In 451, Attila invaded Gaul. Itius assembled a coalition of Romans and Foederati, including Visigoths, and confronted the Huns at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains. Attila was checked and withdrew. It was a rare military success for the embattled West, but structural weaknesses remained. Victories could delay collapse, not reverse it. In 454, the Western Emperor Valentinian III assassinated Idias at court, motivated by fear and jealousy. This removed the empire's most capable military leader and deepened instability. A year later, Valentinian himself was killed. The Western political scene descended into a pattern of short-lived emperors and kingmaker generals. 476, the end of the Western Emperor. By the 470s, the Western Empire was a thin shell. Its territory was mostly reduced to parts of Italy. Its emperor was dependent on the support of powerful generals. Its finances were crippled. One such general was Odoacer, a leader of Germanic soldiers in Italy. In 476, he overthrew the regime and deposed the Western Emperor, a young man named Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus, even his nickname hinting at how he was perceived. Odoacer declared himself ruler of Italy, not as emperor, but as king, nominally recognizing the authority of the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. This is the famous date, 476 CE, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It's meaningful. The title of Western Emperor effectively disappears. Italy is ruled by a non-Roman king. The symbolic continuity breaks. But to people living through it, life continued. Administration carried on in many places. Roman law remained influential. The Eastern Emperor still considered himself ruler of the whole Roman world in principle. It was a significant break, but not an overnight apocalypse. The East lives on here est something crucial. The Eastern Roman Empire did fall in 476. It survived Germanic migrations with less territorial loss. It maintained stronger fiscal systems and a more defensible capital. It continued to call itself the Roman Empire, and its people called themselves Romans, for centuries in fact, for another 1,000 years. Later, historians invented the term Byzantine Empire, but that's a modern label. To itself, it was always Rome. This continuity matters. Roman law was codified under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, shaping legal traditions across Europe and beyond. Roman imperial concepts of authority influenced medieval political thought. When we talk about the fall of Rome, we must remember half of Rome lived on. Why did Rome fall? The factors we debate, historians continue refining explanations. Let me mention a few additional factors often discussed. Disease likely played a role. Earlier plagues reduced population, strained the economy, weakened military recruitment. Lower population meant less tax revenue, fewer soldiers, abandoned lands. Climate and environmental stressors may have affected harvests and contributed to migration pressures, though these are still active areas of research. You have probably heard the lead poisoning theory: lead pipes, lead in wine. Most specialists consider this overstated. Lead exposure had some health effects, but not at the scale needed to explain the empire's complex collapse. Empires do not fall because of plumbing, and Christianity, as we discussed earlier, profoundly changed Rome's value systems and institutions. But Christian emperors also launched wars and enforced authority. The strongly Christian Eastern Empire survived far longer. Religion is part of the story, but not a single decisive cause. Finally, internal social stratification. Over time, large estates and powerful elites gained more privilege and exemption from obligations. Small farmers bore heavy burdens. Many sought protection from local landowners rather than the distant state. Loyalty shifted from empire to local powers. In some ways, this foreshadows feudal relationships in medieval Europe. Transformation, not just collapse. Modern scholarship often treats this period as late antiquity, a time of transformation, rather than simple darkness following Roman light. In many regions, Roman law codes influenced the new kingdoms. Latin evolved into the Romance languages: Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. Roman cities continued as centers of administration and church life, though reduced and changed. The Western Roman Empire fell as a centralized political structure. But Roman civilization melted and rehardened into new shapes. Kings, who were technically Rome's conquerors, issued laws in Latin, minted coins with imperial imagery, consulted Roman advisors, used Roman titles. The past didn't vanish. It became a resource. New rulers borrowed, reshaped, and claimed. So, how did Rome fall? After all this, we can answer more precisely. Rome fell, that is, the Western Roman Empire collapsed as a central authority, because its size and complexity outgrew its ability to manage succession and governance peacefully. Repeated civil wars weakened the state. Its economic structures were strained by crisis, disease, and the loss of key provinces. Debased currency, disrupted trade, heavy taxation eroded resilience. Its military system became increasingly dependent on federated groups and powerful generals. Loyalty became personalized and fragmented. Central control weakened. External pressures, migrating and invading groups, displaced by Huns and others, pushed into an already fragile system. The empire's response was inconsistent, sometimes brutal, sometimes accommodating, often short-sighted. The balance between East and West tilted decisively eastward. When crisis came, the West had fewer resources, weaker institutions, less margin for error, and local and regional powers gradually took over the functions of the imperial state. The imperial title withered. Power shifted into the hands of kings and warlords, many of them Roman. It was not a single battle, not one bad emperor, not one religion, one barbarian tribe, or one unlucky event. It was a long sequence of interacting failures, pressures, and adaptations stretching over centuries. A final thought: when we speak of the fall of Rome, it's easy to picture a single dramatic collapse, temples burning, barbarians pouring through gates, a world ending in flames. But what the records show is something more human. Officials sending letters asking for tax relief because harvests failed, generals pleading for reinforcements that never arrive, bishops negotiating with invading kings to spare their cities, laws being copied by scribes in new courts under new rulers, still in Latin, still calling back to Roman authority. Empires end not only in fire, but also in paperwork, in compromises, in quiet withdrawals from frontier provinces, in the decision of one young emperor to step aside when a general tells him it's time. Rome fell slowly, unevenly, and in such a way that its pieces could be picked up by those who came after. What we call a fall is, for the people living through it, usually a series of adjustments. It's only from far away, from centuries later, that we give it the simple name of collapse. And perhaps that's the real lesson. Empires do not usually end with a roar. They end with a long, complicated, very human series of choices, compromises, and transformations that only later historians will package into a single word: fall.